December 8, 2024, 63-year-old writer Bashar Barhoum wakes up early in the morning in his prison cell in Syria. He was locked in this jail for the last 7 months, and today was going to be the last day of his life. He was scheduled to be hanged. Although Bashar Barhoum was a supporter of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, he had given a television interview some time ago in which he criticized Iran. He accused Iran of exploiting the Syrian people, and this alone was the reason he was imprisoned. On the morning of December 8, he was counting the last minutes of his life. He knew that in a short while the door would open and security forces would come to take him for execution. But as soon as the door opened, he saw that these were not the Syrian security forces, but rebels of the opposition fighting against Assad. They told him that Assad's rule in Syria is over now, and now this entire country is under the control of the opposition forces. Hearing this good news, Barhoum is overwhelmed with joy to the point that he can't even locate his cell phone or belongings in the jail. Without hesitation, he rushes home to inform his family that he is alive. His luck is nothing short of extraordinary. Due to the fall of the government, Barhoum was granted a second chance at life. But friends, did you know that Barhoum wasn't the only one saved that day? In Syria's Sednaya prison, a child who was also marked for execution that day managed to survive. In today's video, let's know the story of Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, whom even ISIS could not defeat at one time, but today his dictatorship collapsed like a pack of cards within 2 weeks. How did this happen, and what's going to happen to Syria now? This is the story of the Syrian civil war. Before 1918, the country of Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire. Look at this map and see where the borders of Syria lie present day. To its east, Iraq is present. In the south, Jordan in Israel. The country of Lebanon is present in the west, and Turkey is present in the north. After defeating the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the European countries which won this war occupied this entire region and divided these areas among themselves. The region of Syria came under the control of France, so from 1918 to 1946, France rules here, and the people here revolt against it. Many battles take place, after which Syria gets independence in the year 1946. But as soon as they become independent, problems start to arrive. People belonging to different religions and sects live in Syria. Take a look at the religious demographics. According to the data of 2014, 74% of the people here believe in Sunni Islam, and around 16% believe in Shia Islam, and around 10% are Christians. Out of these 16% Shia Muslims, most of them, around 12%, are Alawites. Now, Alawite is another religious sect, and some people believe that it is completely different from Shia Islam. But on the other hand, some people believe that it is a subsect of Shia Islam. This is the religious composition, but apart from this, on the basis of ethnicity, there are two main groups in Syria, Arabs and Kurdish. Arabs are 70–80% and the Kurds are around 10%. When Syria became independent, the power came into the hands of the big landholders, of Sunni Arabs, and they did not allow other people to share in the power. At that time, the Arab nationalist Ba'ath political party started becoming popular. It was a secular and socialist party, so students, minorities, and young army officers started getting attracted towards it. In the first 10 to 15 years of independence, many things happened, like the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, in which Syria also participates. In 1958, a union of Egypt and Syria is formed, and both combine to form a new country, United Arab Republic. In 1961, 1962, 1969, many military coups are seen in Syria, but we will not go into the details of everything. But what happens after the military coup of March 1963 is that the power in the army comes into the hands of the supporters of Ba'ath political party. There is also an internal power struggle inside this political party, after which in November 1970, General Hafiz al-Assad seizes power.
An ambitious Minister of Defense seized control. His name was Hafiz al-Assad.
He became the president of Syria in 1971 and soon he established a dictatorship in the country of Syria. The interesting thing is that in a Sunni, Muslim-dominated country, he himself belonged to a minority. He was an Alawite, but despite this, he was popular among the public, because during his time economic development and land reforms were seen, education was encouraged, and the military was strengthened. Not to say that he was not a cruel dictator, he was definitely one. To consolidate power, he used to repress his opponents. Anyone who raised their voice against him was suppressed. Like in 1982, the Sunni militants in Hama rebelled against Hafez al-Assad, but his military responded by brutally killing 20,000 people. This incident is called the 1982 Hama massacre. Gradually, as the years passed, Alawites' control over Syria started increasing. By 1990, Hafez started falling ill. After him, his elder son Basel became the front-runner in the race to become the president of Syria. He was a very popular and charismatic military figure, but in 1994 a car accident happened. Basel was killed in this car accident. Hafez's younger son, Bashar al-Assad, was studying in London to be a doctor at that time. He was studying to become an eye doctor, but he had to return to Syria. On 10 June 2000, Hafez died of a heart attack, and Bashar al-Assad became the new president of Syria. The constitution of Syria was also changed to make Bashar the president. According to their constitution, the minimum age of the president should have been 40 years, but it was reduced to 34 years because Bashar himself was 34 years old at the time. As soon as he came into power, things started changing. As his father ran Syria like a state-controlled economy, there was a system according to which every college graduate was guaranteed a government job and the public was guaranteed free services and cheap food. Bashar aspired to transform Syria into a market-oriented economy. As the government began focusing on economic reforms, many public services were gradually dismantled, leading to a rise in unemployment. While Syrians had been living under a dictatorship, they experienced some level of contentment due to visible development and access to education. However, after the year 2000, these services were steadily withdrawn. And then, in 2006, a terrible famine hit Syria. The drought in Syria was so severe that it continued for 4 years. During these 4 years, 60% of Syria's land turned into desert, and 80% of cattle perished. Experts hold climate change responsible for this drought. After this, desertification is seen on a very large scale in Syria. Syria now needed to import most of the food from foreign countries. Food prices increased, inflation increased. Apart from this, Syria's oil reserves started drying up, due to which the income from oil also started to decline. When life becomes this difficult for the people to survive, the anger against Bashar al-Assad starts to increase. On 17 December 2010, there was an incident in Tunisia which changed the entire Middle East region forever. In a small city in Tunisia, a vegetable vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, was out with his vegetable cart. Then the police snatched his weighing scales because he didn't have a permit to set up his cart. He went to the provincial government building to complain to the governor, but the governor refused to meet him. After this, Mohamed Bouazizi goes out on the street and sets himself on fire, due to which he died. But people standing nearby record a video of this and post it on social media. This video goes viral to such an extent that it reaches the international media. People took to the streets to protest, and soon enough, protests grew so fast that within a month in Tunisia, the dictator Ben Ali's government was overthrown.
أن الرئيس التونسي زين العابدين بن علي قد غادر البلاد وأن الجيش استلم السلطة.
Seeing the power of people against tyranny, people of the neighboring country Egypt are also greatly influenced. They began to protest against their president Hosni Mubarak on 25 January 2011, and by 11th February he had to resign. This fire started spreading fast. Libya too had a dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. Protests were also seen against him. People came out on the street, and on 20th October 2011, Gaddafi was found in a drain he was hiding and was killed. From 2010 to 2012, there were large-scale protests in many Arab countries. Many governments were overturned and many dictators were thrown off their thrones. Protests were seen all over Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Sudan. This movement has been named Arab Spring. The reasons behind all these protests were the same: their falling economies, rising political corruption, rising unemployment, and rise in inflation. Around this time, we saw the rise of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. With the help of these platforms, people found a way to vent their anger. Viral videos of brutality and corruption started spreading everywhere, and people began to be more aware of the injustices. Everyone started realizing that in our country, rich people are becoming richer, all the kings and maharajas are enjoying themselves, and it is becoming difficult for the common man to live. There is a severe shortage of jobs. When a country provides jobs for doctors, engineers, teachers, and civil servants, the citizens can spend more. This is what gives a boost to the economy in the true sense. But these things were just a dream for those people suffering. The effect of the Arab Spring is also seen in Syria. In the early days of these protests, Assad used to say that such protests cannot happen in Syria. Syria is immune to this. But on 6 March 2011, the situation changed. In a small Syrian town of Deira, some teenage boys of a school started writing slogans against the government on the walls. Ijak el Doria Doctor, which means it's your turn next, doctor. Assad could not tolerate any kind of protest against him. These children were arrested by the secret police and they were put in jail and tortured. When the parents and neighbors of these children go to rescue them, a government official tells them to forget the children. If you want children, make more children. If you don't know how, bring us your women and we will make them for you. Following this, protests erupted in the city. The day after the initial incident, thousands of people took to the streets in defiance. In response, the Syrian army arrived and opened fire, killing 4 protesters. The unrest escalated, with even larger demonstrations taking place during the funerals. On March 23rd, 15 protesters lost their lives, and hundreds were injured. In an effort to suppress dissent, authorities cut off water, electricity, and mobile networks in Deira, and funerals were banned as they had become focal points for growing protests. On March 30, 2011, Assad delivered a speech labeling the protests as a foreign-backed conspiracy, a common tactic used by politicians to discredit dissent by branding it as externally funded. Instead of calming the situation, his remarks further fueled the protests, which were met with an intensified crackdown. On April 22, hundreds of thousands of people marched in protest, and human rights groups reported over 100 fatalities. By April 25, the unrest had escalated to such an extent that tanks were deployed in the city of Deira. By this time, reports began emerging from various regions that many Syrian army soldiers were refusing to fire on protesters. A rebellion had started within the ranks. In response, the Syrian army began executing its own soldiers. By July, the rebellion had grown significantly, with a large number of soldiers defecting and forming a separate force known as the Free Syrian Army. Both the protesters and the Free Syrian Army shared a common goal: to liberate the country from the grip of the tyrannical regime at any cost. Within a few months, the Free Syrian Army successfully drove Assad's forces out of several areas, with cities like Aleppo and Raqqa falling under their control. This marked the beginning of the Syrian civil war.
Syria in turmoil fits perfectly to what experts say al-Qaeda's leaders want.
The rebel forces that joined the Free Syrian Army united to form the Syrian National Coalition, declaring themselves as Syria's government in exile and asserting that they were the legitimate government of Syria. This claim was recognized by countries like the United States, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The rebels gained significant public support, evident in August 2012 when Syrian Prime Minister Riyad Hijab defected and joined their cause. However, by this time, the civil war was beginning to transform into a sectarian conflict. Initially, the 2011 protests were non-sectarian, focusing solely on opposing Assad's government. However, since Assad belonged to a minority sect and had disproportionately favored members of his community in government positions, the predominantly Sunni Muslim population gradually turned the conflict into a sectarian war between Sunni Muslims and Syria's minority groups. This divide deepened when countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, all Sunni-majority nations, intervened to support the rebels. Even Hamas, a Palestinian group, withdrew its support for Assad and aligned with the rebels. On the other hand, Shia-majority Iran and groups like Hezbollah sided with Assad. By 2015, several non-Muslim nations, including the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, backed the rebels, while Russia firmly supported Assad's regime. Several proposals were presented to the United Nations to crack down on political support against Syria, but Russia and China consistently vetoed them. You might wonder why so many other countries became involved in the Syrian conflict. The main reason was the rise of the terrorist organization ISIS. This is where extremist militant groups enter the picture. As the Syrian civil war unfolded around 2012, members of al-Qaeda observed the situation closely, seeking an opportunity to exploit the chaos. In January 2012, a group called Jabhat al-Nusra was formed, which called itself the Syrian franchisor of al-Qaeda. In February 2012, the chief of al-Qaeda appealed to all Sunni Muslims to wage jihad against the Syrian government. Now, the interesting thing is that Bashar al-Assad also played a role behind this. In mid-2011, Assad released hundreds of radical extremist militants from jails. These people were going to take up arms against Assad, but still, Assad released them from jail. Actually, Assad wanted to create a villain worse than himself to make himself look good. Assad wanted to show the world that he is secular and was fighting against jihadi forces, and by doing this, he wanted to show that the rebels opposing him were in cahoots with these extremists. Gradually, Jabhat al-Nusra started growing, and the influence of the Free Syrian Army started decreasing. America refused to give arms to the Free Syrian Army, saying that those weapons could go into the hands of the extremists. On the other hand, under the pretext of fighting terrorism, Assad's forces began using warplanes and helicopters to attack rebel bases with missiles and barrel bombs. In December 2012, America declared Jabhat al-Nusra a terrorist organization. But it has the opposite effect. The very next day, many people in Syria take out a march and protest, saying that the only terrorist in Syria is Assad. On 8 April 2013, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi merged the Islamic State of Iraq with Jabhat al-Nusra to form the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, in short, ISIS, or ISIL. During this period, chemical weapons were also used against the Syrian rebels. In April 2013, the US said that Syria has used chemical weapons against its own people. Nerve agent sarin is a gas due to which people's muscles get paralyzed and they stop breathing. According to international law, it is strictly prohibited to use such chemicals even while fighting foreign enemies. But in Syria, not only once, but multiple times, these chemicals were used against its own citizens. In this incident of 21 August 2013, more than 1,000 people were killed by these chemical weapons.
يعني مين ضل من عيلتك؟ مين ضل من عيلتك طيب؟ بس
Because of this, United Nations weapons inspectors went to Syria and found evidence of the use of sarin gas. The UN Secretary General calls it a war crime. The American President Barack Obama says that it was a red line which shouldn't have been crossed, and crossing it meant that America would take military action.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change my equation.
But during Assad's rule, not only chemical weapons were used in Syria, but torture camps were also used. One of their most infamous prisons is Sednaya prison, in which thousands of people were sentenced to death. This camp was on a hill near the city of Damascus. It was built in 1986, but during the time of the Civil War, it was made the main prison camp. People suspected of having links with the rebels were imprisoned here. But that's not all. Some people were thrown into this prison merely because they lived in an area where there were protests against Assad. The prisoners later told the world about how brutally they were tortured. Prisoners were beaten with iron rods, cables, and electric currents. Hanging them upside down and drowning them in water was very common in the jail. The prisoners were also banned from talking to each other. The condition here was so bad that it is difficult to imagine. I cannot even tell you everything in a YouTube video, but I can definitely tell you that Amnesty International in its report has called this jail a human slaughterhouse. It was said that between 2011 and 2018, more than 30,000 people were killed in this one prison camp. Under ISIS rule, the level of brutality reached unprecedented heights. By 2015, ISIS had seized control of approximately 1/3 of Syria and 40% of Iraq, proclaiming these territories as their caliphate, with Raqqa in northern Syria as their capital. This self-declared state functioned almost like an independent country, complete with its own government, legal system, and even its currency, the Islamic State currency. By the end of 2015, the group ruled over a staggering 12 million people. ISIS carried out horrific genocides against minorities and destroyed hundreds of cultural heritage sites. Their war crimes were so appalling that nearly every country globally condemned them. Organizations and nations, including the United Nations, the US, Russia, India, the European Union, Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Malaysia, Egypt, Singapore, Taiwan, China, and even Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, officially designated ISIS as a terrorist organization. In order to dismantle ISIS, the US and its allies intervened directly in the Syrian war, deploying military forces. While Russia claimed to support the fight against ISIS, it later became evident that their operations often targeted Syrian rebels, leading to civilian casualties. This marked the point where the Syrian conflict grew increasingly complex. Think about it. On one side, USA and Russia are fighting. USA is against Assad and is supporting the rebels, but Russia is fighting in support of Assad. But both these sides are also fighting against ISIS. There is Syrian opposition against Assad, there is ISIS, and there are also Kurds. Assad, Syrian opposition, and Kurds are fighting against ISIS. And in between, Turkey also gets involved here. Turkey and Kurds have been fighting for years, so seeing the power of Kurds increasing in Syria, Turkey comes to fight against Kurds. But because the US was supporting the Kurds, so at this point Turkey turned against America. And Iran and Hezbollah are also fighting in support of Assad, but are fighting against ISIS. The result of which is that the whole country of Syria becomes a very terrifying war zone. Whole cities have been destroyed. This is why we got the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015-2016. If so many different groups and countries fight at one place, then what will the common people do? There will be no place left for them to live. By 2016, after a big military campaign, the Syrian army took back control of the Aleppo city from the rebels. The US coalition carried out thousands of airstrikes on ISIS, because of which the Kurdish forces could nearly wipe out ISIS in North Syria. In other areas, Assad's forces pushed back ISIS with the support of Russia. Similarly, in neighboring Iraq, the Iraqi army is successful in their fight against ISIS. The city of Raqqa is taken back from ISIS, and by 2019, ISIS is completely wiped out, except for one or two places. However, the aftermath of ISIS's defeat left Syria in a stalemate, with geopolitical tensions continuing to shape the region. In subsequent years, the Syrian conflict saw further shifts. The Russia-Ukraine war began in 2022, and the Israel-Palestine conflict escalated in 2023, drawing Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah into their own battles. Despite this, in November 2024, Assad's government resumed attacks on rebels, a decision that proved disastrous. On November 27, 2024, rebels launched a counteroffensive, quickly capturing Aleppo by November 30. With Assad lacking the support of Russia and Iran, the rebels seized the opportunity, advancing rapidly and taking one city after another. Russia's limited capacity to assist Assad due to its involvement in Ukraine hindered its ability to counter the rebels effectively. The Syrian army's economic struggles further weakened its defenses. By December 8, 2024, the rebels captured Damascus, marking a pivotal moment. They stormed prison camps where countless people had been tortured. As soon as Bashar al-Assad realized that he was losing control, he immediately got on the airplane and fled the country. Now there are reports that he has been given asylum in Russia, where he was poisoned and hospitalized. And this was the end of dictatorship in Syria. People in Syria came out on the streets in large numbers to celebrate freedom from dictatorship. As soon as Assad ran away, people went to his presidential palace and started looting and burning it. The Syrian civil war spanned nearly 14 years, claiming the lives of around 500,000 people and displacing approximately 13 million others. Among these, 4.8 million now live as refugees in foreign countries. But this leads us to a critical question: what comes next? Unfortunately, the answer might not be as hopeful as one would wish. Many rebels who overthrew Assad were affiliated with extremist organizations. Reflecting on the Assad regime, Bashar Assad's father ruled Syria as a dictator for 30 years, followed by Assad's 23-year tenure. Despite this long reign, the dictatorship crumbled in just 2 weeks. A classic example of the dictator's dilemma. Dictators often live in a bubble of flattery and misinformation, shielded from their country's grim realities. This false sense of security breeds poor decisions, ultimately leading to their downfall.